unbelievable act of heroism that will leave you speechless. On a freezing winter night, a homeless man was minutes away from freezing to death on the streets of New York. But what happened next is so shocking it will leave you breathless. Global superstar Taylor Swift stepped in a way no one could have imagined. What did she do to save his life? How did she change this man's fate forever? Discover the heartwarming story that has moved the world, one you won't believe until you read it. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching us from. The ambulance sped through the streets of New York, its red and blue lights illuminating the freezing night. Inside, James lay motionless on the stretcher, his trembling body covered in a thin layer of frost. The paramedics worked frantically around him, monitoring his vital signs and trying to keep him alive. "We need to get to the airport as soon as possible," one of the paramedics shouted as he adjusted the thermal blanket over James's body. "Taylor Swift's plane is already waiting." James, in his feverish state, could barely distinguish reality from his hallucinations. To him, the sound of the ambulance siren blended with the icy wind he remembered from the street. His half-closed eyes caught glimpses of lights, but he didn't know whether they were from the ambulance or a plane landing in the middle of the city. "Where am I?" he murmured weakly, his voice barely a whisper. "You're safe, James," one of the paramedics responded, trying to calm him. "We're taking you somewhere where they can help you." But James couldn't understand. In his mind, he was still on the street, curled up on the sidewalk, feeling the cold slowly consuming him. The sound of the ambulance's engines transformed into the roar of an airplane, and the red and blue lights became the bright landing lights illuminating the dark street. "Is this real?" he wondered, confused. Or was it just another illusion created by his frozen mind? Suddenly, the sound of the engines grew louder, closer. James half opened his eyes, and in his delirium, he thought he saw a plane descending onto the street, its blinding lights cutting through the darkness like a ray of hope. The propellers stirred the freezing air, and the sound of the engines filled the empty street. "Don't worry, we're here to help you," a familiar voice shouted, but James couldn't tell if it was real or part of his imagination. Was it Taylor Swift? In reality, the ambulance arrived at the airport, where Taylor Swift's private jet was waiting on the runway, its lights blinking like beacons in the night. Taylor was there, wrapped in a thick coat, her blonde hair blowing in the wind. Her eyes reflected unwavering determination as she watched the medical team load James onto the plane. "We're going to save him," Taylor said firmly, looking at the doctors. "No matter what it takes." James was quickly taken on board, and Taylor followed, never taking her eyes off his pale, emaciated face. Before the door closed, she looked out onto the runway, as if expecting to see someone else. But there was no one, just the freezing wind and the darkness. The plane took off swiftly, leaving behind the city that had witnessed James's suffering. As they ascended, Taylor sat beside him, holding his hand firmly. "Rest," she said softly. "You're safe now." James closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of her hand and the comforting hum of the plane's engines. But in his mind, the questions kept spinning. Who was this woman who had appeared out of nowhere to save him? And why did she seem so determined to make sure he survived? James was not always a homeless man. 10 years ago, he lived in a small apartment in Brooklyn with his wife, Laura, and their daughter, Emily. He worked as an electrician for a local company, a stable job that allowed him to support his family. On weekends, he would take Emily to the park, where they played on the swings and shared ice cream. Laura often prepared homemade dinners, and the evenings were filled with laughter and conversations around the table. However, everything began to change when James lost his job. The company he worked for closed due to financial problems, and although he searched for work for months, he found nothing stable. Bills piled up, and soon they could no longer pay the rent. Laura, overwhelmed by the pressure, began to distance herself. Arguments became more frequent, and eventually Laura decided to file for divorce. She took Emily and moved with her family to another state. James was left alone in the apartment, struggling to stay afloat. Without a job and without his family, he fell into a deep depression. He began drinking to forget his pain, which only worsened his situation. One day, he received news that shattered him completely. Laura and Emily had died in a car accident. The loss left him devastated, with no strength to move forward. With no money or emotional support, James lost the apartment and ended up on the streets. At first, he tried to seek shelter in homeless shelters, but they were always full. The cold nights became his worst enemy, and winter hit him with full force. James went from being a man with a stable life to fighting to survive day by day, with nothing but his memories and the cold that slowly consumed him. It was one of the coldest nights of winter in New York. The thermometer read -10 degrees Celsius, and the icy wind cut like a knife. James walked through the empty streets, searching for shelter. He knew he couldn't spend another night outdoors, not in this cold. He headed to the nearest shelter, a place where he had slept before when he had no other option. When he arrived, he saw a line of people waiting outside. The shelter was full, and the staff couldn't take in more people. James approached the door, hoping they would make an exception, but they told him there was no space. He tried to explain that he couldn't stay outside, that the cold would kill him, but it was no use. The shelter was already at capacity. With no options, James resigned himself to searching for another place. He walked several blocks, but all the shelters he knew were just as full. Finally, he decided to take refuge in an alley near an abandoned building. At least there, he would be somewhat protected from the wind. He sat on the ground, leaning against the wall, and wrapped himself in a tattered blanket he had found days earlier. The cold was unbearable. James felt it seep through his clothes, freezing his skin and numbing his limbs. He tried to move to generate warmth, but his body was too weak. Every breath was an effort, and the cold air burned his lungs. He knew he couldn't fall asleep, that if he did, he might not wake up. But the exhaustion and the cold were too much. Hours passed, and the cold only worsened. James began to feel numbness in his fingers and toes. He tried to rub his hands to warm them, but he could no longer feel anything. His vision blurred, and his body began to tremble uncontrollably. He knew he was in trouble, but there was nothing he could do. He had nowhere to go, no one to ask for help. Finally, exhaustion overcame him. His eyes closed, and his body relaxed, unable to fight the cold any longer. James lost consciousness, curled up in the alley, as snow began to fall over him. It was midnight when a passerby, walking quickly to shield himself from the cold, saw a motionless bundle in an alley near an abandoned building. He stopped, hesitating for a moment, but something about the way the body lay made him think it wasn't just a pile of clothes. He cautiously approached and discovered James, almost completely covered in snow, trembling weakly, his lips purple from the cold. Alarmed, the passerby took out his phone and called 911. "I need an ambulance, fast. There's a man here, unconscious and nearly frozen. I don't know how long he's been like this," he said, his voice trembling with concern. While he waited, he gently tried to shake James to see if he would respond, but there was no reaction. In less than 10 minutes, an ambulance arrived at the scene. The paramedics quickly got out, equipped with thermal blankets and a vital signs monitor. One of them knelt beside James and checked his pulse. "He's alive, but just barely. We need to get him to the hospital right now," he said as his partner prepared the stretcher. James was wrapped in thermal blankets and placed in the ambulance. During the ride, the paramedics worked to stabilize him, administering oxygen and monitoring his body temperature. He's in severe hypothermia. His heart is working at its limit, one of them commented while adjusting the oxygen flow. Upon arriving at the hospital, James was taken straight to the emergency room. The doctors examined him immediately. His body temperature is dangerously low. We need to warm him up gradually, but there's something else, said the attending physician, reviewing the test results. His heart is failing. He needs urgent heart surgery, and we can't do it here. We need to transfer him to a specialized hospital in Minnesota. The medical team began making calls to coordinate the transfer, but time was critical. Every passing minute reduced James's chances of survival. Meanwhile, in another part of the hospital, a friend of Taylor Swift, who worked as a nurse, overheard the conversation about the case. He knew Taylor was in the city and that her private jet might be the only option to save James. Without wasting time, he grabbed his phone and called her. "Taylor, there's a man here who needs urgent help. If we don't transfer him now, he won't survive," he explained. Taylor, without hesitation, responded, "Use my jet. Do whatever it takes to save him." Meanwhile, in the emergency room, the doctors continued working to keep James stable, waiting for news about the transfer. They knew that without a miracle, James wouldn't have another chance. Taylor Swift was in her hotel suite in New York, going over the final details of her concert schedule for that night. The atmosphere was calm, with her team organizing everything for the performance. Suddenly, her phone rang. It was a call from Mark, a close friend who worked as a nurse at the hospital where James had been taken. "Taylor, I need your help." "It's urgent," said Mark, his tone making it clear that the situation was serious. Taylor, sitting on the edge of the bed, responded immediately. "Tell me what's going on." Mark quickly explained the situation. "There's a man here, James. He was found on the street, nearly frozen. He has severe hypothermia and needs urgent heart surgery. The problem is that the surgery can only be performed at a specialized hospital in Minnesota, and we don't have time to transport him on a commercial flight. If we don't get him there soon, he won't survive." Taylor didn't think twice. "Use my jet. They need it more than I do right now." "What else can I do?" she asked, standing up and beginning to pace the room, focused on the conversation. Mark thanked her, but also warned her about the logistical challenges. "We need to move him fast. The medical team has to go with him, and time is critical. Can we organize everything in less than an hour?" Taylor nodded, even though Mark couldn't see her. "Call my pilot. He already knows what to do. Tell him to prepare the jet and be ready to take off as soon as they arrive at the airport. I'll handle the details from here." She hung up and quickly called her personal assistant. "Cancel everything I have for the next few hours. There's an emergency, and I need my jet ready for a flight to Minnesota. Make sure the medical team has everything they need on board." While her assistant took care of the details, Taylor sat on the couch, thinking about James. She didn't know him, but she knew his life depended on what happened in the next few hours. She couldn't help but feel a mix of worry and determination. She knew her private jet was a luxury, but at that moment, it was the only option to save someone who desperately needed it. Minutes later, Mark called again. "Everything's ready at the hospital. We're preparing James for transport. Your pilot is already at the airport, and the medical team is ready to accompany him. Taylor, this could save his life." Taylor took a deep breath. "Do whatever it takes. I'll handle the costs and anything else they need. Just make sure he gets to Minnesota on time." As she hung up, Taylor looked out the window of her suite. The city of New York sparkled under the cold winter sky, but her mind was on James, at the hospital, and on the journey that would give him a second chance. She knew she had made the right decision, and she was willing to do everything possible to ensure James had a chance to live. At the hospital, the medical team worked tirelessly to stabilize James. His body temperature remained dangerously low, and his heart struggled to stay stable. The doctors knew that every minute counted. Meanwhile, Taylor Swift, who was in her dressing room at Madison Square Garden preparing for that night's concert, received an urgent call from Mark, her nurse friend. "Taylor, we need your jet." "James doesn't have much time," Mark explained, his voice tense. Taylor didn't hesitate for a second. "Use my jet. Do whatever it takes to save him," she responded. But then she paused. She knew that situations like this required direct supervision. "I'm coming over. I can't stay here knowing someone needs help." Quickly, Taylor informed her team that she would postpone the final rehearsals for the concert. "This can't wait," she told them as she threw on a thick coat and rushed out of the backstage area. Her personal assistant followed, making sure everything was ready for the transfer. In less than 20 minutes, Taylor arrived at the airport. The private jet was already on the runway, its lights blinking in the darkness of the night. The icy wind blew through her blonde hair, but she didn't seem to notice. Her eyes reflected unwavering determination as she watched the medical team load James onto the plane. "We're going to save him," Taylor said firmly, looking at the doctors. "No matter what it takes." As the paramedics secured James inside the jet, Taylor spoke with her pilot. "We need to get to Minnesota as fast as possible. This is a medical emergency," she told him. The pilot nodded and began the final preparations for takeoff. Taylor also made sure that the medical team had everything they needed to keep James stable during the flight. "If you need anything else, tell me now. We can't afford any mistakes," she told the doctors, who thanked her for her support and attention to detail. As the jet prepared for takeoff, Taylor received a call from the hospital in Minnesota. "We're ready to receive him. The surgical team is standing by," they informed her. Taylor breathed a sigh of relief, but knew that the race against time wasn't over yet. "Thank you. I'll let you know when we're on our way," she replied. Finally, the jet took off. Taylor remained on the runway, watching as the plane's lights disappeared into the darkness of the sky. She knew she had done everything possible for James, but she still couldn't relax. "Now it's up to them," she murmured, wrapping her coat tighter around her. Her assistant approached and reminded her that the concert was scheduled for that night. Taylor nodded, but her mind was on James. "We're going to the hospital in Minnesota after the concert. I need to make sure he's okay," she told her assistant, who nodded and began making the necessary arrangements. As she got into her car, Taylor couldn't help but feel a mix of hope and concern. She knew that, even though she couldn't control the outcome, she had done everything in her power to help someone in desperate need. Her action was not just an act of generosity, but also a reminder that, even in the middle of a busy schedule, there's always time to help others. Taylor Swift's private jet took off from New York with James and the medical team on board. The night was cold and clear, but the tension inside the plane was palpable. James lay on a stretcher, connected to monitors that emitted constant sounds, indicating that his heart was still beating, albeit irregularly. Taylor, sitting beside him, held his hand firmly, as if she could transmit some of her own strength to him. "James, you're safe," she said softly, as the plane ascended into the night sky. "We're going to Minnesota, where they'll help you. You just have to hold on a little longer." James, in his semi-conscious state, didn't respond, but his hand trembled slightly, as if trying to hold on to something. The pilot, from the cockpit, announced that the flight would take approximately 2.5 hours. However, there was a problem. The bad weather in Minnesota was worsening. There's a snowstorm in the area. It could complicate the landing, the pilot said over the intercom. Taylor looked at the doctors, who exchanged worried glances. "We have no other choice. We have to get there," said one of them. The flight proceeded relatively calmly during the first hour. Taylor stayed by James's side, speaking to him in a low voice to keep him conscious. "I don't know if you can hear me, but I want you to know you're not alone. Many people are working to save you." James didn't respond, but his breathing, though weak, remained steady. However, as the jet approached Minnesota, the conditions worsened. The snowstorm had reduced visibility, and the wind shook the plane forcefully. The pilot announced that they would have to circle the airport until conditions improved enough to land. "Fuel is limited," he warned. "We can't wait too long." Taylor, without losing her composure, asked the doctors if James could hold on longer. "Every minute counts," replied one of them, "but we have no other choice." Taylor nodded and approached the intercom. "Do what you have to do, but get us on the ground as soon as possible," she told the pilot. The plane began circling the airport as the storm intensified. The fuel was running dangerously low, and the tension in the cabin increased. Taylor, without letting go of James's hand, continued speaking to him. "We're almost there. Just a little longer," she said, as if her words could protect him from the storm surrounding them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the pilot announced they would attempt to land. "Brace yourselves, this could be rough," he warned. The plane descended sharply, buffeted by strong winds. Taylor clung to James's stretcher, while the doctors made sure the medical equipment was securely fastened. The landing was turbulent. The plane hit the runway hard, and the tires screeched against the ice. For a moment, it seemed they might lose control, but the pilot managed to stabilize the aircraft. When the plane finally came to a stop, a sigh of relief swept through the cabin. "We made it," Taylor said, looking at James. Her face reflected a mix of relief and concern. She knew the race against time wasn't over, but at least they were in Minnesota. The medical team moved quickly. James was taken off the plane and transferred to an ambulance waiting on the tarmac. Taylor watched them go, praying that everything would turn out well. As the ambulance drove away, she stayed at the airport, wrapped in her coat, feeling the cold of the night, but with a heart full of hope. The pilot approached her. "It was a tricky landing, but we made it," he said. Taylor nodded, grateful. "Thank you. Without you, this wouldn't have been possible." As the jet prepared to return to New York, Taylor knew she had done everything she could for James. Now, all that was left was to wait and trust that the surgery would be successful. But, for the first time in hours, she allowed a glimmer of hope to light up her heart. She knew that, no matter the outcome, she had made a difference in the life of someone who desperately needed it. Upon arriving at the hospital in Minnesota, James was taken directly to the operating room. The medical team that had accompanied him on the jet quickly handed over the reports to the surgeons, who were already prepared for the procedure. Taylor Swift, although unable to enter the surgical area, remained in the waiting room, wrapped in her coat with a worried expression on her face. The hospital was modern and well-equipped, but the tension in the air was palpable. Taylor sat in one of the waiting room chairs, her hands clasped together and her eyes fixed on the door leading to the operating room. She knew the surgery was complicated and that James was in critical condition, but she trusted that the doctors would do everything possible to save him. While waiting, Taylor decided to use her influence to ensure that James received the best care possible. She called her personal assistant, who was in New York, and asked them to contact the hospital administrators. I want to make sure nothing is missing. If they need additional equipment or extra personnel, let me know. I'll cover the costs, she said. Minutes later, the hospital director approached Taylor. Miss Swift, I want to thank you for your generosity. We have mobilized our best surgical team for this operation. They are doing everything possible, he explained. Taylor nodded, grateful, but she couldn't help feeling anxious. Thank you. Please keep me updated on any developments, she replied. The hours passed slowly. Taylor constantly checked her watch, wondering how the surgery was progressing. At one point, a nurse stepped out of the operating room and approached her. The surgery is ongoing. James is stable, but it's a delicate procedure. We will inform you as soon as we have more information, she said. Taylor nodded, trying to stay calm. Meanwhile, Taylor received several calls from her team in New York. The concert was scheduled for that night, and they needed to know if she would be present. I can't go, she said firmly. This is more important. Postpone the concert or find a solution, but I'm not leaving here until I know James is safe. Time continued to pass, and the tension in the waiting room grew. Taylor paced back and forth, unable to sit still. She knew the surgery could take several hours, but every passing minute felt like an eternity. Finally, after what seemed like forever, the lead surgeon stepped out of the operating room. Taylor quickly approached, her heart pounding. "How is he?" she asked, trying to read the doctor's expression. The surgeon, though exhausted, gave a slight smile. The surgery was a success. James is stable, but is still in critical condition. The next few hours will be crucial, but we have done everything possible. Taylor breathed a sigh of relief, but she knew the battle wasn't over. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "Thank you for saving his life." The surgeon nodded and explained that James would be transferred to the intensive care unit for recovery. Taylor, though she couldn't see him yet, felt a wave of hope. She knew she had done everything possible for James, and now all she could do was wait and trust that he would recover. As she sat back down in the waiting room, Taylor allowed a few tears of relief to slip down her cheeks. She knew that no matter what happened next, she had made a difference in the life of someone who desperately needed it. And in that moment, that was the only thing that mattered. James woke up slowly, feeling a dull pain in his chest and a heaviness throughout his body. The soft sounds of monitors and the murmurs of nurses surrounded him, but he couldn't remember how he had gotten there. He tried to move his arms, but one of them was connected to an four. His mouth was dry, and his mind was foggy. "Where am I?" he murmured, his voice hoarse and weak. A nurse quickly approached upon hearing him. "You're in the hospital, in Minnesota. You had heart surgery a few hours ago. You're safe," she explained calmly. James tried to process the information, but everything seemed blurry. "Surgery? What happened?" he asked, still disoriented. The nurse adjusted his pillow and offered him some water. "We found you on the street in New York. You were suffering from hypothermia and needed urgent surgery. Taylor Swift brought you here in her private jet. Without her, you wouldn't have survived." James blinked, trying to understand. "Taylor Swift? The singer?" he asked, incredulous. The nurse nodded with a smile. "Yes, she helped you. She's very concerned about you." As James tried to absorb the information, the door to the room opened softly. Taylor entered, dressed casually and with an expression of relief on her face. "Hi, James," she said quietly, approaching his bed. "I'm glad to see you awake." James looked at her, still confused. "Are you Taylor Swift?" he asked, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Taylor nodded and sat in a chair beside his bed. "Yes, it's me." I heard about your situation and wanted to help. We brought you here so you could have the surgery." James closed his eyes for a moment, trying to remember. "I don't remember much, just the cold," he said, his voice trembling. Taylor gently took his hand. "You don't have to worry about that now. What's important is that you're safe. The doctors say the surgery was a success, but you'll need time to recover." James looked at her, tears in his eyes. "I don't know how to thank you. I don't know why you did this for me," he said, his voice breaking. Taylor smiled kindly. "Because everyone deserves a second chance, James. And I wanted to make sure you had yours." Taylor explained that she had not only covered the costs of the surgery and the transport, but would also ensure he had a safe place to recover. "I've spoken with a rehabilitation center nearby. They'll help you regain your strength and reintegrate into society. You won't be alone in this," she told him. James couldn't believe what he was hearing. "I don't know what to say. This is too much," he murmured, tears streaming down his cheeks. Taylor squeezed his hand firmly. "You don't have to say anything. Just focus on recovering. When you're ready, we'll talk about the future." As Taylor said goodbye to let James rest, he looked at her with a mix of gratitude and amazement. "Thank you for everything," he said, his voice barely audible. Taylor smiled at him one last time before leaving the room. "Rest, James. I'll be here if you need me." As she left, Taylor stopped in the hallway and took a deep breath. She knew James's road to recovery would be long, but she was determined to support him every step of the way. For the first time in a long time, James felt he wasn't alone, and that, perhaps, his life could take a different direction. After the surgery, James was transferred to a specialized rehabilitation unit near the hospital in Minnesota. The center was designed to help people in critical situations recover both physically and emotionally, and Taylor Swift made sure that James had access to all the necessary resources. On his first day at the center, James was welcomed by a team of professionals, including physical therapists, psychologists, and social workers. "We're here to help you with your recovery," one of the therapists explained as she guided him to his room. James, still weak but with newfound hope, nodded silently. Physical recovery was slow but steady. The physical therapist worked with James to regain strength in his muscles, which had weakened after weeks on the street and the surgery. At first, even getting out of bed was a challenge, but over time, James began walking short distances with the help of a walker. In addition to physical recovery, James began attending psychological therapy sessions. For years, he had carried the pain of losing his family and the failure of his past life. In the sessions, he spoke about his past, his losses, and how he had ended up on the street. "It's normal to feel pain, but it's also important to learn to live with it and move forward," his therapist told him in one of the sessions. James, though initially resistant, slowly began to open up. Taylor, although she couldn't be there all the time, stayed in constant contact with the rehabilitation center. Through her personal assistant, she ensured that James had everything he needed, from new clothes to books and materials for his therapy sessions. Additionally, Taylor coordinated with the center's team so that James could receive job training. "I want him to have the tools to reintegrate into society," she explained to the center's director. James began attending training workshops in basic skills, such as computer literacy and customer service. Although he initially felt insecure, he soon discovered that he enjoyed learning new things. "I never thought I could do something like this," he told one of his instructors with a shy smile. One of the biggest challenges for James was finding a place to live after his recovery. Taylor, anticipating this, had worked with a non-profit organization to secure him temporary housing. "It's a small apartment, but it's yours for now," a social worker explained to him. Hey, you can continue recovering while you look for a job and stabilize yourself. When James visited the apartment for the first time, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was modest, but it was clean and had everything he needed: a bed, a small kitchen, and a bathroom. "This is more than I've had in years," he said, tears welling in his eyes. The social worker smiled at him. "It's a new beginning, James. Make the most of it." Over time, James began to feel more confident. The therapy sessions helped him process his pain, and the job training gave him a new perspective on his future. Although he knew the road wouldn't be easy, he was determined not to waste the opportunity that Taylor and so many others had given him. One day, while at the rehabilitation center, he received a call from Taylor. "Hey, James. I just wanted to check in on you," she said, her voice warm and kind. James told her about his progress, the apartment, and the training workshops. "I'm so proud of you," Taylor told him. "I know this hasn't been easy, but you're doing an amazing job." James was grateful for her words, but he also wanted to express something more. "Taylor, I don't know how I can ever repay you for everything you've done for me. I have no words to thank you." Taylor responded sincerely, "You don't need to repay me, James. I just want you to have a better life. That's enough for me." After hanging up, James sat on his bed, looking out the window of his new apartment. For the first time in years, he felt like he had a future ahead of him. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he wasn't alone. With the support of Taylor and the rehabilitation team, James was ready to rebuild his life, step by step. A few weeks after James began his recovery, Taylor Swift decided to share his story on her social media. She knew that James's experience was not unique and that many people in similar situations needed help. With James's consent, Taylor posted a message on her platforms, accompanied by a photo of her with him in the hospital, where both smiled shyly. "This is James's story," Taylor wrote in her post. A few weeks ago, James was found on the streets of New York, fighting for his life due to extreme cold and health issues. "I had the opportunity to help him get to a hospital where his life was saved." Today, James is in recovery, working hard to rebuild his life. His story reminded me that we all deserve a second chance, and that sometimes a small act of kindness can change everything. Taylor went on to explain how James had lost his home and family due to a series of tragic events, and how his situation was no different from that of many others living on the streets. Homeless people are not invisible. They are human beings with stories, dreams, and dignity. We can do more for them, whether by donating, offering our time, or simply being kind. Taylor's post quickly went viral. Within hours, millions of people had read James's story, and comments began flooding social media. Many shared their own experiences helping people in vulnerable situations, while others were inspired to take action. "Thank you for reminding us that we can all make a difference," wrote one follower. "This story made me cry. I'm donating to a local shelter today," commented another. Non-profit organizations working with homeless people also joined the conversation, thanking Taylor for using her platform to raise awareness. The impact of Taylor's post was not limited to social media. Several media outlets picked up the story, highlighting not only Taylor's selfless act, but also the importance of addressing the homelessness crisis across the country. TV programs and newspaper articles discussed how James's story had touched millions and inspired others to act. In the following days, donations to organizations helping homeless people increased significantly. Local shelters reported receiving more volunteers and resources than ever before, and many people began sharing similar stories in their own communities. Taylor, seeing the impact of her message, decided to take it a step further. She organized a campaign in collaboration with several charities, pledging to match donations up to a certain amount. "If we all give a little, we can make a big difference," she said in a video she posted on her social media. The campaign raised millions of dollars in just a few days, and Taylor made sure the funds were distributed to shelters, rehabilitation programs, and support services across the country. But the impact wasn't just financial. James's story also changed public perception of homeless people. Many began to see them not as problems or invisible, but as individuals with complex stories and dignity. On the streets, people began to smile more, offering food or a kind word to those in need. Meanwhile, James continued his recovery in Minnesota. When he was shown Taylor's post and the thousands of positive comments, he couldn't help but feel emotional. "I never thought my story could inspire so many people," he told his therapist. "It's amazing to know that something good came out of all this." Taylor, for her part, felt deeply satisfied seeing how her action had created a ripple effect of kindness and compassion. She knew the road to solving the homelessness crisis was long, but she also knew that every small step counted. And, at that moment, she was proud to have taken one of those steps. Months after the surgery and his recovery, James had made significant progress in his life. Thanks to therapy, job training, and the constant support of Taylor Swift and the rehabilitation team, he now lived in a small apartment and worked part-time at a community center. Although his life wasn't perfect, he felt that he finally had direction and purpose. One day, he received a call from Taylor. "Hi, James. I wanted to see if you'd like to meet up with me. I'd love to hear how things have been going for you all this time," she said with her warm and kind voice. James, both excited and nervous, accepted without hesitation. "Of course, Taylor. It would be an honor to see you again." The meeting was arranged at a quiet cafe in Minneapolis, near where James lived. Taylor, always discreet, arrived in casual clothes and sunglasses, avoiding drawing too much attention. When James entered the cafe, he recognized her immediately and walked over to her table with a shy smile. "Taylor, I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done for me," James said as he sat across from her. Taylor smiled and extended her hand. "You don't have to thank me, James. Just seeing how far you've come is more than enough." During their conversation, James told Taylor about his new life. "I work at a community center, helping people who are going through situations similar to what I experienced. I want to give back some of what I received," he explained, with pride in his voice. Taylor listened attentively, impressed by his determination. "That's incredible, James. I'm so proud of you." James also talked about his therapy sessions and how they had changed his perspective. "I learned that I can't change the past, but I can build a better future. And all of that was possible because of you," he said, tears in his eyes. Taylor gently took his hand. "It wasn't just because of me, James. You put in the effort and the willpower. I just gave you an opportunity." The conversation continued, and Taylor asked about his future plans. "I want to keep helping others," James responded firmly. "I know what it feels like to be alone and hopeless, and I don't want anyone else to go through that. I'm thinking of creating a program to connect homeless people with resources and opportunities, like the ones you gave me." Taylor smiled, moved by his initiative. "That's a wonderful idea, James. If you need help getting it started, count on me." James appreciated her words, but also wanted to express something more. "Taylor, you didn't just save my life. You gave me a second chance, and that's something I will never forget." At the end of their meeting, Taylor and James said goodbye with a hug. "Keep going, James. "I'm very proud of you," Taylor said with a sincere smile. James nodded, feeling a mix of gratitude and determination. "Thank you, Taylor, for everything." As he walked out of the cafe, James felt that a new chapter of his life was beginning. He knew the road wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he wasn't alone. With Taylor's support and his own inner strength, he was ready to move forward and help others find their own second chance. A year after their meeting at the cafe, James had made significant progress in his life. Thanks to his determination and the support of Taylor Swift, he now worked full-time at a non-profit organization that helped homeless people in Minneapolis. His role involved connecting people with resources such as temporary housing, medical care, and job training programs, something he had experienced firsthand. "It's amazing to see how someone can change their life when given a chance," James told a coworker during a team meeting. "I've been there, and I know how it feels. That's why I want to make sure others have the same opportunity one had." Meanwhile, Taylor Swift continued to use her platform to advocate for the most vulnerable. After sharing James's story on her social media, she had launched an initiative called Second Chances, which raised funds for organizations helping homeless people across the country. Additionally, Taylor visited shelters and community centers, listening to people's stories and ensuring their voices were heard. One day, Taylor decided to visit the organization where James worked. She wanted to see firsthand how her support had impacted not only James's life, but also the lives of many others. When she arrived at the center, James greeted her with a wide smile and a heartfelt hug. "Taylor, I can't believe you're here," said James, visibly emotional. "I want to show you everything we've achieved thanks to you." Taylor smiled and replied, "It wasn't thanks to me, James. It was thanks to your effort and dedication. I just gave you a hand." James took her on a tour of the center, introducing her to his co-workers and some of the people being helped by the organization. "This is Michael," he said, pointing to a middle-aged man participating in a job training workshop. "A few months ago, he was on the streets, but now he has a job and a place to live." Taylor listened attentively, impressed by the impact the organization was having on the community. During the tour, James told Taylor about his future plans. "I want to expand this program to other cities. I know there are many people who need help, and I want to make sure they get it," he explained. Taylor nodded, excited. "That's a wonderful idea, James. If you need help, count on me." At the end of the visit, Taylor and James sat down for coffee in the center's common room. "I'm so proud of you, James," Taylor said with a sincere smile. "You've turned your experience into something positive, and that's incredible." James thanked her for her words but also wanted to express something more. "Taylor, you didn't just give me a second chance. You gave me a purpose. And for that, I'll always be grateful." Taylor looked at him affectionately. "Everyone deserves a second chance, James. And you're proof that, with a little help and a lot of determination, it's possible to change things." As Taylor said goodbye and prepared to continue with his schedule, James stayed at the center, feeling a mix of gratitude and hope. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he wasn't alone. With Taylor's support and his own inner strength, he was ready to move forward and help others find their own second chances. If this story moved you, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss more inspiring content. Share this video with friends and family who need to see stories that challenge perspectives and leave an indelible mark. Explore our channel to discover stories that inspire and transform. Until the next video. The story of James and Taylor had not only changed their lives, but had also inspired millions of people to act with compassion and generosity. And, at that moment, Both knew the future was hopeful because they had shown that, with an act of kindness, we can all make a difference.